Did you know ancient Egyptians sometimes removed brains through the nose? Or that certain organs were kept in specific jars? The intricate, often stomach-turning details of mummification were a testament to their unwavering belief in the afterlife. Prepare to have your understanding of this ancient art completely transformed. Because for the Egyptians, death wasn't the end. It was a doorway. Life in the Nile Valley was harsh, fragile, uncertain. Crops failed, floods killed, diseases swept through villages. But death itself? That could be controlled, at least in appearance. A properly prepared body meant a soul that could live forever. That's why mummification mattered so much. It wasn't morbid obsession, it was the greatest insurance policy of all time. Picture this. A man, wealthy enough to afford the service, breathes his last breath in Thebes. His family wails, tearing their clothes, smearing dust on their faces. But almost immediately, the embalmers are called. Not priests of the temples, not doctors, but a very specific guild of professionals, men who lived on the margins of society. Their work was holy, yes, but also filthy. They were both feared and needed, like butchers of the sacred. The body is carried to the Per-Nefer, the house of beauty, a polite term for the embalming workshop. It's little more than a low chamber near the Nile. The air is thick with smoke from incense and the sharp tang of natron salts piled in jars. Resin simmers in small braziers, releasing a smell that masks, but never fully hides, the stench of death. The embalmers wear masks, often of jackals, representing Anubis, god of mummification. This isn't for sanitation. It's theatre, ritual. Anubis himself is believed to stand among them, watching. Every cut, every gesture is both practical and spiritual. The family doesn't stay long. They come to choose the package. Because yes, even death had tears. The wealthy could pay for the full intricate process. The brain removed, organs dried and placed in jars, the body carefully preserved for eternity. The middle class got a cheaper version. Fewer steps, less time, still a shot at the afterlife. The poor, barely scraping together coins, often ended up buried in sand with little more than linen rags. Eternity, like everything else, came at a price. But for this man, the family spares no expense. They want the full treatment, the kind reserved for nobles and scribes. Payment is handed over, offerings to the gods are promised, and the embalmers get to work. The first thing they do is wash the body, not with plain water, but with palm wine and Nile water. The wine disinfects, the water purifies. The body is stripped of clothes, hair trimmed, and laid naked on a stone slab. Already, the embalmers whisper prayers, calling on Anubis to protect the process. Because here's the strange paradox. They must violate the body to preserve it. And that violation carries danger. Everyone in the room knows what comes next. The most infamous step of all. The removal of the brain. To the Egyptians, the heart held the soul, but the brain was just mush, a useless sponge. Still, it had to come out, because decay began there quickly. The tool is long, thin, hooked, made of bronze. One embalmer slides it through the nostril, twisting, breaking the bone of the ethmoid, stirring the grey matter into liquid. It drips out, foul and acrid, through the nose. Sometimes chunks are pulled piece by piece. Other times they simply let it drain. The smell is unbearable. Even with incense burning, even with resin boiling, everyone smells it. To the family, this part is hidden. They would never watch. To them, mummification is sacred. But the embalmers know it's also grotesque. The brain is thrown away. No jar, no prayers, just trash. And this is only the beginning. Soon the belly will be opened, the organs removed, the body stuffed, salted, reshaped, wrapped, and enchanted. Weeks of labour lie ahead. The man will be transformed from a corpse into something unrecognisable, something meant to last forever. For the Egyptians, this wasn't disturbing. It was beautiful. Every cut, every prayer, every layer of linen meant the difference between eternal life and eternal death. To us it looks brutal. To them it was the ultimate act of love. So here we stand in the House of Beauty as the embalmers begin their sacred violation. The air hums with chanting, the lamps flicker, and the journey of turning a dead man into a god begins, one slice at a time. The House of Beauty. That's what they called it. But step inside, and beauty is the last word that comes to mind. The air is thick with a strange cocktail of incense, boiling resin, and something sourer beneath, the faint stench of death. This is the place where bodies are undone and remade, where flesh is cut, drained and salted, all in the name of eternity. The embalmers move in silence, faces hidden behind masks of jackals. Not for hygiene. No, these masks mark them as the servants of Anubis, the jackal-headed god who guides the dead. To the living, these men are a paradox. They're holy because they handle sacred work. Yet they're also feared, almost untouchable. No one wants to share bread with a man who spends his days elbow deep in corpses. Still, when death comes, everyone begs for them. Eternity can't be risked. Along the walls are tall jars of natron, the desert salt that will dry the corpse. Bundles of linen sit ready, clean and white, waiting to be cut into strips. Tools are laid out, bronze knives, hooked rods, curved spoons, simple but lethal in their purpose. A carved statue of Anubis watches from the corner, ears pricked, black eyes gleaming in lamplight. Every man in the room bows slightly when passing. They know he is watching. Not everyone is allowed to see what happens here. Families deliver the body, pay the price, and leave. To them, mummification is sacred mystery, but in truth, it is blood, smoke, and cutting. And while the embalmers work, the family outside begins their own rituals. Women tear at their hair, smear mud on their faces, wailing so loudly it echoes through the streets. Professional mourners are often hired, women whose job it is to scream, cry, and even beat their breasts, so the gods themselves cannot ignore the grief. Death in Egypt was not silent. It was a performance as noisy as life itself. Inside the chamber, the priests begin to chant. They invoke the gods, calling for protection as they prepare to desecrate in order to preserve. To modern eyes, this chamber is grotesque, but to the Egyptians, it is hope. Every smell of resin, every strip of linen, every whispered prayer is part of a deal. The promise that their loved one will walk again in the field of reeds, a paradise beyond the grave, a world where crops grow tall without effort, where the Nile never fails, where families feast forever. But before paradise comes the knife, the most infamous step. The Egyptians believed the heart was memory, thought and soul. The brain, just useless matter, and so it was destroyed. A thin rod of bronze, tipped with a hook, is slid through the nostril. A crunch breaks the quiet, the ethmoid bone pierced. Then comes the stirring. The embalmer twists the rod, shredding tissue, turning the brain to liquid. The sound is wet, sloshing, obscene. Resin smoke rises to mask the stench, but nothing hides it completely. Assistants lean close, linen in hand, wiping as foul fluid drips from the corpse's nose. Sometimes they drag out chunks piece by piece, dropping them into bowls. The brain is discarded like garbage. For us, it feels like desecration. For them, it was devotion. Decay starts in the brain. To leave it inside was to doom the body. This wasn't destruction, it was purification. At the same time, outside the workshop, more rituals unfold. Neighbours and kin gather with food, drink, and offerings. Bread, beer, and onions, yes, onions, were placed near the body or burned as offerings, because they believed the dead still hungered. Even during mummification, families left meals near the door, whispering to the spirit, "Don't be angry, don't wander, don't haunt us. We are feeding you until you can walk again." Inside, the embalmers rinsed the hollow skull with palm wine. Sometimes they filled it with resin, sometimes with linen or spices, so the head would not collapse. They had stripped away thought but kept the face. A contradiction, brutal yet sacred. And so beneath the mask of Anubis, a man drags a hook through a corpse's skull, believing he is helping it live forever. The belly is next. This is the step the embalmers fear the most. Not for the gore, but for the spiritual danger. To pierce the body is to insult it. So when the cutter takes up the obsidian blade and slices into the left flank, another priest immediately shouts curses at him. "Butcher! Criminal! Enemy of the dead!" The insults echo against stone walls. It is ritual, not anger. One man must carry the guilt, so the rest may continue. The cut hisses, gases escaping. The smell is brutal, rot, bile, sour decay. Hands reach inside. The stomach slips out, soft and foul. The intestines are dragged next, long coils glistening in lamplight. The lungs are pulled, spongy and wet. The liver, heavy, comes last. Each organ is rinsed with wine, packed in natron, dried. Nothing is wasted. This is when the canopic jars appear. Beautiful stone containers, lids carved as faces of gods. Human, falcon, jackal, baboon, the sons of Horus. Each jar is not just a container, it is a guardian. Families believed these jars were small tombs themselves, where the organs would live, protected until the soul needed them again. Meanwhile, mourners outside scream louder. Some tear their clothes, others smear their faces with ash. They shout the name of the deceased again and again, because to speak a name was to keep a person alive. If the name was forgotten, the soul perished. Every scream was not just grief, it was survival. Back inside, the empty cavity is washed with wine and packed with spices. Cinnamon, cassia, frankincense, myrrh, smells worth more than gold. The corpse reeks, but beneath it, the perfume lingers. The embalmers are not just preventing rot, they are masking death with the sense of eternity. The first cut is closed, the organs drying in their jars. The corpse is hollow, but it has been saved. The belly has been emptied. The cavity glistens, blackened with resin, stuffed with spices to fight decay. Around the slab stand 4 jars, each carved from alabaster or limestone, lids shaped like heads. To an outsider, they look like decorations. But to the Egyptians, they were guardians, small tombs within the greater tomb, the canopic jars. Each jar held not just an organ, but a piece of identity, a piece of life, and each organ was tied to a god. The stomach, slippery and foul, belonged to Duamutef, the jackal-headed guardian. To us, the stomach is where hunger lives. To the Egyptians, it was the centre of nourishment, the proof of life's constant need. Duamutef's jackal head promised protection from poisons and rot so that the dead would never hunger in eternity. The intestines, long coils carefully washed, went to Kebesenuef, the falcon-headed protector. The intestines were seen as the channels of transformation, where food turned into strength. Kebesenuef's falcon eyes watched over them, ensuring purity. The lungs, spongy and fragile, were given to Hapi, the baboon-headed god. Breathing was the gift of air, the breath of life, Happy ensured the dead would breathe again in the field of reeds, that their chest would never suffocate in eternity. The liver, heavy and dark, went to Imseti, the human-headed guardian. The liver was more than an organ. It was the seat of emotions, blood, and vitality. To lose it without protection was to risk a joyless afterlife. Imseti kept the soul's warmth alive. One by one, the organs were rinsed in palm wine, dried with natron, wrapped in linen, and placed inside the jars. Each was blessed, each sealed with spells from the Book of the Dead. These jars were not just storage, they were lifelines. Without them, the spirit would wander incomplete, unable to rebuild itself when the gods called. But here's the strangeness. Not all Egyptians could afford such care. The rich paid for every organ, every jar, every priestly blessing. The poor often had nothing. Sometimes their stomachs and intestines were simply tossed away. Sometimes the jars were fakes, empty stone containers placed in tombs for show, as if pretending was enough to trick the gods. And then there was the heart. The embalmers paused before it, hesitating. The heart was too important to remove lightly. It was not packed into a jar. It was left inside the body, or replaced with a scarab amulet carved from stone. Why? Because in the afterlife, the heart was judged. Picture this: the soul standing in the hall of two truths before Osiris, god of the dead. The heart is placed on one side of a great scale. On the other side, the feather of Maat, goddess of truth and justice. If the heart is lighter, if the soul lived in truth, the scales balance. The dead pass on to eternal paradise. But if the heart is heavy with sin, it tips. Waiting at the foot of the scales is a monster. Amit, part lion, part crocodile, part hippo. She devours the heart whole. The soul ceases to exist, not punished, not tortured, simply erased. This was the terror of every Egyptian, not to suffer, but to vanish. And so they begged the embalmers to protect the heart, to place charms and spells over it. Some even commissioned papyrus scrolls to be buried with the body, filled with words that instructed the heart itself not to betray its owner. One famous spell reads, "O my heart, do not stand as a witness against me." While the embalmers packed the organs, outside the workshop the family prayed. They offered food and drink to the spirit, knowing it hovered nearby. Bread, onions, beer, figs. Women sang dirges to Isis and Nephthys, the mourning sisters of Osiris, their cries rising into the sky. Passers-by heard and joined in, because in Egypt, mourning was communal. The louder the grief, the more honoured the dead. Back in the chamber, the jars were sealed. Wax was dripped around the lids, linen tied, inscriptions carved, names of gods, protective spells, sometimes even threats against thieves. These jars were placed beside the body, always four, always in a line. Centuries later, when tombs were plundered, the canopic jars often survived even when the coffins were shattered. Archaeologists opened them to find shrunken, resin-soaked organs, still smelling faintly of spices, strange, grotesque relics of a faith so absolute, it turned viscera into treasure. To the Egyptians, though, this was not grotesque. It was necessity. A man without his stomach could not eat in paradise. A woman without lungs could not breathe in eternity. The gods demanded completeness. The jars gave it. So when you imagine a mummy lying in its tomb, don't just think of the wrapped figure. Think of the 4 jars beside it. Guardians, containers, symbols of eternity. Think of the family screaming the name of the dead, keeping it alive with every breath. Think of the embalmers, their hands slick with organs, whispering prayers as they sealed the lids. To us it looks like butchery. To them, it was survival. The organs were eternity itself, fragile, preserved, guarded by gods in stone. For us, the brain is the throne of memory and thought. For the Egyptians, it was useless jelly. The true self, the seat of wisdom, morality and memory, lived in the heart. And when death came, the heart wasn't just flesh-pumping blood. It became the soul's witness. The heart remembered everything. Every lie, every kindness, every theft, every prayer. That's why embalmers handled the heart with reverence. Sometimes they left it inside the body. Other times, when decay threatened, they removed it and replaced it with a carved stone scarab, polished black or green. This wasn't decoration, it was protection. Because what happened to the heart after death was terrifying. The Egyptians believed that when a person died, their soul travelled to the Hall of Two Truths, where Osiris, Lord of the Underworld, presided over judgment. There in the silence of eternity, the heart was placed on a golden scale. On the other side, the priests imagined, rested the feather of Maat, goddess of truth, justice, and cosmic balance. If the heart was light, unburdened by lies and cruelty, the scales balanced. The soul passed into the field of reeds, paradise. But if the heart was heavy with sin, the scales tipped. And waiting just below was Amit the Devourer, a monstrous beast with the head of a crocodile, the front of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus. She opened her jaws and consumed the heart whole. There was no hellfire, no eternal torture, only something far worse to the Egyptian mind, annihilation. The soul ceased to exist, no afterlife, no memory, no name, oblivion. This fear haunted every Egyptian. They could live in poverty, endure famine, even die young, but to be erased? To be denied eternity? That was the ultimate terror, and so they clung to their heart, begged it not to betray them. Amulets were crafted for this purpose. Heart scarabs, carved from stone, inscribed with spells from the Book of the Dead. The most famous reads, "O my heart, do not rise against me as a witness. Do not oppose me before the tribunal. Do not tip the scales against me. It is a plea, almost a bribe. Stay quiet, stay loyal." Families paid scribes to copy entire scrolls of these spells, long papyri rolled and placed in tombs beside the mummy. These scrolls were manuals for the dead, instructions on how to pass judgment, how to speak the right words, how to avoid pitfalls in the underworld. To us, it looks like superstition. To them, it was survival. Imagine facing eternity with a cheat sheet, hoping the gods couldn't tell the difference. Even in life, people carried small charms shaped like hearts or feathers. Farmers wore them while ploughing fields. Soldiers tied them into their armour. Women wore them as pendants. Every beating heart was a reminder that one day it would be weighed. And here's a strange fact. Sometimes, during mummification, embalmers made mistakes. Archaeologists have found mummies with no heart at all, removed, discarded, forgotten. For that person, in Egyptian belief, eternity was lost. To us, it's an archaeological puzzle. To them, it would have been horror beyond words. Outside the embalming chamber, this belief shaped daily life. Egyptians gave alms to the poor, not out of kindness, but because they feared a heavy heart. They confessed sins aloud to statues of gods, hoping to lighten the burden. They even wrote letters to the dead, apologising for wrongs, begging forgiveness, anything to make sure their heart wouldn't tip the scales. At funerals, mourners sometimes whispered to the corpse, reminding it to keep calm in judgment. Say the words, walk in truth, do not fear Amit. They treated the heart as a separate being, a double that could betray or save. And so, when embalmers wrapped the chest, layering resin-soaked linen, they did more than preserve flesh. They were preserving a soul's last hope. Scarabs were slipped under the bandages, pressed against the chest like a secret pact. The body might be silent, but the scarab would speak in its place, whispering to the gods, "This heart is pure. Let this soul pass." Imagine standing in the Hall of Two Truths. The silence is vast, broken only by the creak of scales. Osiris watches, his green face stern. 42 judges stand in a row, each demanding truth. The feather of Mahat gleams, impossibly light, and your heart, heavy, trembling, is placed against it. Every choice, every action, every secret you ever held is about to be measured. One tilt, and Amit waits. That's why the heart mattered more than any other organ. That's why the embalmers guarded it, why families spent fortunes on amulets and spells. Because eternity wasn't guaranteed. It hung on a single weight, the fragile balance of a heart and a feather. The organs have been sealed in their jars. The cavity is stuffed with linen and resin-soaked spices. The heart has been protected with charms, but the body itself is still vulnerable, still fragile, still alive with the slow chemistry of decay. If left as it is, it would rot in days, and so comes a stage that transforms the corpse from flesh into something eternal. Natron drying. Natron was no ordinary salt. Found in the Wadi Natron, north of Cairo, it was a mix of sodium carbonate, sodium bicarbonate, and small traces of other minerals. To the Egyptians, it was more than a preservative. It was divine. Natron was the substance of purity. Priests used it to wash their hands before rituals, to scrub idols clean before prayers, to cleanse their mouths after sacrifices. And here, in the House of Beauty, natron was the weapon that defeated rot. The body was placed on a low table, the cavity packed with natron. Buckets of the white powder were poured over the corpse, covering it completely until nothing remained visible but a mound of crystalline salt. The embalmers pressed it down, ensuring every crevice, every fold of skin was filled. Even the mouth and nostrils were stuffed with plugs of natron-soaked linen. The body was entombed in salt, and then they waited 40 days. The number wasn't random. In Egyptian belief, 40 was the time needed for transformation, a symbolic cycle. Just as it took the Nile roughly 40 days to flood and recede, so too would it take 40 days to strip the body of water and prepare it for eternity. The chamber grew quiet during this time. The body was left alone, checked occasionally by apprentices, who scraped away pools of dark fluid that oozed from beneath the mound. Imagine the sight. Thick brownish liquid seeping out of the salt, the corpse inside sweating out its very essence. The smell was sharp, sour, tinged with death. Assistants used clay bowls to catch the runoff, disposing of it far from the family's eyes. To show them would be unthinkable. They believed the body was resting in sacred slumber. The reality was decomposition, slowed but not yet defeated. Meanwhile, the family outside was not idle. Mourning did not end with the first cut. For 40 days they brought offerings to the spirit. Bread, beer, onions, fish. They whispered the dead's name aloud every day, because to forget a name was the true death. Priests visited the home to perform purification rituals, burning incense, sprinkling water, driving away restless spirits. In wealthier families, servants continued to live as if the master were merely absent, keeping his bed fresh, his sandals ready, his staff by the door. The illusion of presence was powerful. The number 40 carried echoes into Egyptian imagination. Just as it took 40 days for the dead to dry, It was believed that the soul also wandered during this time, hovering between the worlds of the living and the dead. Families lit lamps at night to guide it home, fearing that without light it might stray into darkness forever. Back in the chamber, the natron worked relentlessly. Slowly, the body shrank. The skin, once pliable, hardened into leather. Muscles collapsed, leaving hollows. The face sank, lips retracting from teeth, eyes collapsing inward. What remained was no longer flesh. It was something other, something between a corpse and a statue. The embalmers uncovered the body at intervals, brushing away salt, replacing it with fresh powder. Each time, the corpse looked less human. To modern eyes, this would have been grotesque, a body shriveled, blackened, skeletal, but to the embalmers, this was beauty. They saw not rot, but eternity taking shape. By the 40th day, the transformation was complete. The fluids were gone, the smell subdued, the corpse was dry, light, and hollow. When the apprentices lifted it, it creaked like old wood. Death had been defeated. The body would not rot further, but the process left the body fragile, thin, almost skeletal. And so the embalmers began the next task, rebuilding. Here is where the line between preservation and artistry blurred. They stuffed the cavity with clean linen, sawdust, even mud or resin, reshaping the torso, plumping the chest, making the figure look alive again. False eyes were inserted, sometimes carved from stone, sometimes painted on linen. Wigs were fitted, perfumed oils were rubbed on the skin, masking the harshness of salt. The dead were not meant to look skeletal, they were meant to look eternal. Meanwhile, the family prepared the tomb. Stonemasons carved scenes on walls, banquets, hunting trips, servants carrying jars of beer. Every image was a promise. If it was painted on the wall, the dead would have it in the afterlife. Fishermen cast nets forever. Musicians played eternally. Wives stood beautiful and young by their husbands' sides. And when the family visited the embalming chamber at intervals, they saw only ritual. Priests chanting over salt, incense thick in the air, the body hidden under white powder. They were never shown the dripping fluids, the shriveled limbs, the reality of decay. Their belief had to remain intact. 40 days of waiting, 40 days of prayer, 40 days of transformation. For the living, it was grief stretched across weeks. For the dead, it was rebirth. And when the salt was finally brushed away, what remained was not their husband, their father, their wife. It was something new, a husk of flesh hardened against time, a body no longer human, yet destined to last forever. When the natron was finally brushed away, what remained was not a man, not a woman, not even something recognisably human. The 40 days of salt had stripped the body of softness, of weight, of life. What lay on the slab was shrunken, leathery, fragile. The skin clung tight to the bones, the lips pulled back to reveal teeth in a frozen snarl. The fingers were shriveled claws, the eyes sunken pits of darkness. The body might last forever, but eternity in this state was unthinkable. The embalmers understood this. To them, preservation was only half the work. The other half was reconstruction. The corpse had to look whole, look worthy, look ready for the judgment of the gods. The soul would return to this body. It had to recognise itself. So they began the delicate work of rebuilding. The cavity, now dry and hollow, was packed with linen, resin, even sawdust. In some cases, embalmers used mud or sand, moulding it inside the chest to restore the shape of ribs and shoulders. Arms and legs, thin and stiff, were padded with more linen. The body swelled again, not with life, but with illusion. From shrunken husk to human outline, the change was remarkable. The face was treated with particular care. False eyes were sometimes fitted into the sockets, small stones polished and painted, or onions cut and placed to mimic the curve of an eyeball. Eyelids were drawn shut with resin or sewn in place. The mouth was packed with linen, lips reshaped with wax or mud. A face had to greet the gods, and it had to look serene. Hair was oiled and combed. For the wealthy, wigs were fitted, thick plaits of human hair or fibre perfumed and curled. Jewellery might be placed on the head, diadems, beads, golden bands. To the living, it looked like adornment. To the Egyptians, it was power. Every piece of jewellery carried protection, magic, the blessings of gods. Oils were rubbed into the skin. Myrrh, frankincense, cedar oil, all thick and sticky, leaving the skin dark and glossy. Resin was brushed over the body like varnish, hardening into a protective shell. To us it looks eerie. To them it was sacred armour, sealing the body from decay. And between every layer of wrapping, every fold of cloth, went amulets, tiny scarabs for rebirth. Eyes of Horus for protection, ankhs for eternal life. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, were slipped into the linen, pressed against the skin. Each carried a spell. Each whispered a prayer. Together, they formed a fortress of magic, a body within the body. This reconstruction wasn't just practical. It was spiritual theatre. The Egyptians believed that in the afterlife, a person appeared as their ideal self. But to achieve that, the body had to be presented properly. If the corpse looked broken, the soul might be confused. If it looked incomplete, the gods might reject it. By reshaping, oiling, adorning, the embalmers weren't restoring flesh. They were restoring identity. And here's the irony. Even as the embalmers worked to rebuild, the family was doing the same in memory. Outside the chamber, relatives commissioned painters and sculptors to create images of the dead, statues, painted panels, murals on tomb walls. The dead were always depicted young, strong, flawless, wrinkles vanished, wounds healed, deformities erased. A man who limped in life would stride strong in death. A woman who bore scars from childbirth would appear radiant, ageless. It was a conspiracy between body and image. The embalmers built the illusion in flesh. The artists built the illusion in stone and paint. Together, they ensured that eternity would not remember the frailty of the living, but only the perfection of the dead. Of course, not everyone received such care. The poor, whose bodies dried in pits of sand or were wrapped hastily in linen, went to eternity shriveled, incomplete. Archaeologists have found budget mummies so crudely preserved that limbs fell off, jaws hung open, skin peeled in flakes, and yet even these were buried with charms, prayers, the hope that the gods would overlook imperfection. But for the wealthy man lying in the house of beauty, every detail mattered. The padding of the chest, the smoothness of the face, the gloss of resin, the amulets pressed close to the skin, all of it was theatre, and theatre was magic. One final step remained before the wrappings began. The body was perfumed. Bowls of crushed herbs, incense and oils were burned, their smoke curling around the corpse. Assistants fanned the air, driving the scent into the chamber. To us it might feel like masking the odour of death. To the Egyptians it was sacred breath, the very air of the gods. When the soul returned to this body, it would breathe in not decay but holiness. And so, after 40 days of salt and weeks of reconstruction, the body was no longer a corpse. It was a vessel, a shrine, a fragile but eternal house for the soul. But the greatest transformation was still to come. The endless layers of linen, the cocooning of the body in fabric and spell, The corpse had been reshaped, stuffed, polished. Its skin was hard, darkened by resin, its chest padded with linen, its face restored to something resembling humanity. Yet it was still a husk, dry, rigid, lifeless. Now came the stage that blurred the line between flesh and statue, between body and idol, the anointing and painting of the dead. Bowls of oils were carried into the chamber. Cedar oil, myrrh, frankincense, lotus essence, each pungent, heavy, sweet. Resin bubbled in small braziers, thick smoke rising to coat the rafters. Assistants dipped linen swabs into the oils, rubbing them over the skin until it gleamed. The smell was intoxicating. Sharp cedar, bitter myrrh, sweet lotus, all mixing into a perfume so strong it masked the lingering hint of salt and decay. To us this looks like embalming cosmetics. To the Egyptians it was far more. Oils and perfumes were the breath of the gods. They weren't just covering smell, they were filling the body with divinity. Every stroke of oil was a blessing, every scent a shield against corruption. The colours mattered too. Sometimes embalmers painted the skin, yellow for women, red for men, the same palette used in tomb paintings. The pigments were mixed with oils, brushed onto leathery flesh, transforming a shriveled corpse into something that resembled life. A man emerged, bronzed and strong, a woman pale and glowing. In truth, the body looked nothing like the living person. But that wasn't the point. It was about presenting an ideal to the gods. The face received the greatest care. Black coal was traced around the eyes, echoing the living custom. Eyelids were darkened, brows restored with pigment, lips painted red. Imagine the sight, a dead face, glossy with resin, staring back with eyes lined in coal, as if ready to step into the afterlife's banquet hall. The dead were not supposed to look like corpses. They were supposed to look beautiful. And beauty, in Egypt, was not vanity. It was morality. To appear perfect before the gods was to declare purity. An ugly corpse suggested corruption, sin, danger. A radiant mummy declared, "This soul is worthy." Meanwhile, priests recited hymns as the oils were applied. Verses from the Book of the Dead, invocations to Osiris and Anubis, chants to ward off decay demons. The words were as important as the oils. Without them, the anointing was just a cosmetic. With them it became a spell. The symbolism of scents ran deep. Myrrh was associated with rebirth. Its bitter smoke evoked the transition between life and death. Lotus symbolized creation, because the flower bloomed fresh every morning from the mud of the Nile. Frankincense was light, purity, the sun's heat captured in resin. To cover the body in these was to wrap it in the very essence of eternity. Outside the chamber, the family smelled the same perfumes burning in censers. The aroma drifted through the streets, signalling to neighbours a body was being prepared for the afterlife. Smell itself became a ritual. In Egyptian belief, the senses did not die. A soul in the afterlife could still smell, still taste, still hear. To perfume a corpse was to give it pleasure, even in death. But this stage was not only sacred, it was theatrical. Wealthy families sometimes attended, standing at the edge of the chamber, as priests smeared their loved one in oils, murmuring blessings. To them, the sheen of perfumed skin was proof. The process was working, death was being undone. They didn't see the shriveled corpse beneath. They saw gloss, colour, scent. Illusion was part of the magic. Even stranger, sometimes embalmers repaired deformities or wounds. Archaeologists have found mummies with wax noses, moulded to replace broken ones, painted to match the skin. Missing fingers were reconstructed with linen and resin, wrapped carefully so no god would notice. In one case, A missing penis was replaced with a wooden model, varnished and painted black, because no man could face eternity incomplete. The oils hardened as they dried, leaving a sticky, glossy shell over the flesh. It was armour, sealing the body, holding it intact, and with every layer the embalmers whispered, "You are strong, you are beautiful, you are eternal." Outside life mirrored death. Women anointed their skin with oils daily, not just for beauty, but for sanctity. Perfume cones of fat and incense were placed on their wigs during festivals, melting slowly in the heat, releasing fragrance drop by drop. What the living did for pleasure, the dead received as ritual. And so the body emerged from this stage less a corpse than an idol. It gleamed, perfumed, painted, kohl-rimmed. It no longer belonged to the world of flesh. It had become a divine statue, a shrine of linen and resin, waiting to be clothed in wrappings and words. Soon the priests would begin the most iconic act of all, the wrapping of linen, the cocooning of flesh in endless strips, the slow transformation into the figure we now call a mummy. But without the oils, without the perfumes, without the paint, it would have been just a dried husk. With them, it was sacred beauty, an eternal body for an eternal soul. Now came the act everyone imagines when they hear the word mummy, the wrapping. But what people don't realise is just how elaborate, how theatrical, and how deeply magical this part truly was. It wasn't simply winding cloth around a corpse. It was building eternity one strip at a time. The linen lay in stacks along the walls, clean, white, cut into long strips, some wide, some narrow. To us, linen is fabric. To the Egyptians, linen was sacred. Priests wore it exclusively. Offerings were wrapped in it. And the gods themselves were said to be clothed in linen light. To bind the dead in linen was to clothe them as divine beings. The process began at the fingers and toes. Each digit was wrapped individually, a tiny cocoon of cloth, sometimes padded with resin-soaked bundles to restore shape. Nails were painted with henna or gilded with gold foil. One by one, the fingers disappeared beneath white strips, then the hands, then the arms, feet, ankles, calves, thighs, each bound carefully, layer upon layer. Between every layer went amulets, scarabs, ankhs, eyes of Horus, djed pillars for strength, tiyet knots of Isis for protection. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, were slipped into the folds. Each amulet carried a spell, each pressed against a vital part of the body. The Book of the Dead instructed exactly where to place them. A heart scarab over the chest, a solar disc on the forehead, a golden tongue between the lips so the dead could speak in the afterlife. Archaeologists have found mummies bristling with these objects, a hidden jewellery box sewn into the very fabric of eternity. Priests chanted continuously. Every strip of cloth had a prayer. You are wrapped in the protection of Isis. You are bound in the embrace of Osiris. Their voices rose and fell in rhythm with the winding, until the act of wrapping became a liturgy, a spell woven into fabric. And here's the strangeness. The wrappings weren't always just plain linen. Some were dyed red or yellow, others inscribed with magical texts. In certain cases, strips of papyrus were used, pages of the Book of the Dead themselves, torn and wrapped directly into the mummy. It wasn't enough to place a scroll nearby. The spells had to be sewn into the body itself. Layer upon layer, the body swelled. Resin was brushed on each fold, hardening into a sticky shell. The smell was sharp, acrid, sweet. Priests smeared honey on some layers, believing it deterred insects. They rubbed oils between cloth, making the wrappings both adhesive and aromatic. The face was given special care. Sometimes a gilded mask was placed over it, not the golden mask of Tutankhamun that Hollywood adores, but simpler masks of cartonnage, plastered linen painted with eyes and lips. They weren't portraits, they were idealizations. A farmer might be given a serene painted mask, a scribe a face lined with wisdom. The mask wasn't meant to look like the person, it was meant to look divine. Outside, the family heard the chanting, smelled the incense, saw priests emerge occasionally with bowls of used linen or empty resin jars. To them, the wrapping was holy mystery. To the embalmers, it was grueling, sticky, repetitive labour. Hands blackened with resin, sweat dripping in the smoky chamber. They wound strip after strip until hours blurred into days. And yet, the result was astonishing. The corpse vanished, replaced by a shining figure of linen and resin, stiff glowing with oils, heavy with amulets. It was no longer human, it was a sacred bundle, a vessel for a soul. This stage also reflected Egyptian life. The living wrapped their infants tightly in swaddling cloths, believing it protected them. The dead were swaddled the same way, reborn into the afterlife. Death wasn't an ending, it was a second birth, and linen was the womb. The process could take weeks. Wealthy mummies used hundreds of meters of cloth. Poorer ones, only a few layers. But every mummy, no matter how humble, was wrapped. Even if just in one torn sheet, the act mattered more than the material. When the last strip was tied, the priests recited a final incantation. You are made whole. You are Osiris. You are eternal. Incense smoke curled upward, mingling with the smell of resin and myrrh. And so, from a shriveled leathery husk, emerged something unearthly, a white cocoon, shining with oil, sealed in spell, heavy with the weight of eternity. The mummy was ready, but before it could leave the House of Beauty, one last ritual had to be performed. The opening of the mouth. Without it, the soul could not eat, drink, or speak in the afterlife. And no amount of linen would matter if the dead entered eternity mute and starving. The body was wrapped, sealed, perfumed. It looked whole again, serene, divine, ready for eternity. But to the Egyptians, a mummy without a voice, without senses, was incomplete. What good was eternal life if the soul could not eat, drink, see, or speak in the afterlife? That was the purpose of the opening of the mouth ritual, a ceremony as strange as it was sacred, one final act of magic to reawaken the body's senses. The priests prepared the instruments. Some were simple, chisels, adzes, curved blades. Others were more symbolic, a forked tool shaped like a fishtail, wooden wands carved with sacred designs, even spoons of ivory. Each tool had a specific gesture, a specific incantation tied to it. The mummy was placed upright, supported by attendants, its stiff linen shell gleaming in the lamplight. Family members, if wealthy enough, were invited to attend. They watched as the high priest, masked as Anubis or Horus, stepped forward, carrying the ritual adze. He touched the tool to the mouth, once, twice, 3 times. Each touch was accompanied by words. Your mouth is opened, your lips are released, you may speak in the presence of the gods. Then he touched the eyes. Your eyes are opened, you may see the sun god rise. Then the ears. Your ears are opened, you may hear the hymns of the living and the voice of Osiris. The nose. Your nostrils are opened, you may breathe the sweet air of the field of reeds. Even the hands and feet were touched, as if reanimating not just senses but movement. Each gesture was small, but together they formed a resurrection. It looked theatrical, almost like pantomime. But to the Egyptians it was power. Without this ritual, the soul would enter eternity, blind, mute, deaf, suffocated. With it, the soul could feast, sing, see, breathe, and rejoice forever. There was another layer too. The tools themselves carried magic. The adze used for the mouth was often made from iron, a rare and sacred metal, believed to fall from the sky as bones of the gods. Using it was not just symbolic, it was literally calling on the heavens to grant life. Meanwhile, priests recited passages from the pyramid texts and Book of the Dead, invoking gods by name. The chants described the dead as becoming Osiris himself, restored to life through divine magic. Each spoken word was a spell, each gesture a key. Outside the chamber, mourners sang laments. Professional mourners, often women, played the roles of Isis and Nephthys, the sisters of Osiris crying for their brother's death. Their wails rose into the night, echoing through the village. The dead were never left alone. Their names, their memories, their sounds filled the air, ensuring they would not be forgotten. But the opening of the mouth had another, stranger function. In Egyptian thought, statues also required this ritual. When a new statue of a god or pharaoh was carved, priests performed the same gestures, opening the eyes, ears and mouth, to animate it, to give it spirit. To them, there was no difference between a lifeless statue and a lifeless corpse. Both needed divine breath to awaken. And so, in the House of Beauty, the line between human and idol blurred. The wrapped mummy stood like a statue, rigid, shining with resin. The priest's adze tapped against it, declaring it alive once more. To the family, it was proof their loved one was not gone, but transformed. To the embalmers, it was the final step in a long performance, a ritual as old as Egypt itself. Archaeologists have found traces of this ritual in tombs, little sets of tools buried beside the mummy, instructions painted on a papyri, detailing where to touch, what to say. In one tomb, a priest had scribbled a correction mid-ritual, as if reminding himself not to forget a line. Even eternity had its stage directions. After the mouth was opened, offerings were brought forth. Trays of bread, onions, beer, roast fowl. The priest pressed food against the lips of the mummy, as if feeding it. To us, the sight is absurd, a corpse with its mouth stuffed with onions. To the Egyptians, it was literal magic, the dead eating, drinking, filling themselves for the journey ahead. Wine was poured, incense burned, hymns sung. The family sometimes joined in, tasting food themselves, as if sharing a meal with the deceased. Death was separation, but rituals like this blurred the boundary. The dead sat among the living one final time, fed and honoured, before being sealed away forever. The opening of the mouth was more than a ritual. It was a proclamation. This person lives again. Without it, the journey to the afterlife might fail. With it, the mummy was no longer a husk but a vessel ready for eternity. The embalming was now complete, but the work was not done. The mummy still needed to be carried to its tomb, accompanied by processions, chants, offerings, and more rituals. The House of Beauty had done its part. Now the desert awaited. The House of Beauty had done its work. The body was no longer a corpse, but a vessel, wrapped, perfumed, sealed, and magically awakened. Now it was time to leave the dark chamber and face the world once more. The funeral procession was not quiet mourning as we imagine today. It was spectacle, noise, ritual, a parade of the living and the dead through the sunlit streets of Egypt. The coffin, often wooden and painted, sometimes gilded, was lifted onto a sledge or carried on the shoulders of men. The wrapped figure inside lay stiff and silent, But the coffin shouted its presence with colour, painted eyes gazing outward, hieroglyphs chanting eternal spells, images of gods standing guard. It wasn't just a container, it was a voice declaring to everyone who looked, "Here lies a person who will live forever." At the head of the procession came priests, shaking sistra, rattles sacred to Hathor, beating drums and burning incense. The air filled with smoke and rhythm. Behind them came the mourners, women tearing their hair, smearing their faces with dust, shrieking as if their hearts had been torn apart. Some were family, others were professionals hired to wail. It didn't matter. The louder the grief, the more honoured the dead. The coffin moved slowly through the streets, past mud brick homes and bustling markets. Chickens scattered, dogs barked, neighbours stepped outside to watch. Death was not hidden in Egypt. It was public. It was theatre. Strange rituals occurred along the way. At certain crossroads, the coffin was lowered, priests circling it with incense, chanting prayers to drive off wandering spirits. At others, offerings were placed in the street: bread, beer, onions, gifts to the dead and to the gods. Sometimes even small figurines of servants, called ushabtis, were thrown into the procession, each destined to serve the deceased in the afterlife. Women playing the roles of Isis and Nephthys followed close behind, their bodies swaying as they sang laments. "Rise, Osiris, return to us." In these moments, every funeral was a reenactment of the myth of Osiris, the god slain and resurrected, whose body was wrapped just as the corpse in the coffin was now. The deceased was not merely a person. He or she had become Osiris, walking the same path of rebirth. And yet, amidst the ritual grief, there was celebration too. Musicians played flutes, harps, drums. Wine was poured, bread handed out. Death for the Egyptians was not only sorrow, it was transition. Families knew that if all went well, their loved one was not lost but alive in another world. The procession was both funeral and festival, mourning and hope entwined. In wealthier funerals, oxen or donkeys dragged sledges piled with grave goods, jars of beer and wine, sacks of grain, baskets of figs, even furniture, beds, chairs, chests of clothing, weapons, jewellery, everything a soul might need. Imagine the spectacle. An entire household, piled high, dragged through the streets to be buried underground. To us it looks like waste, to them it was necessity. A man could not face eternity empty-handed. As the procession reached the edge of the desert, the Nile behind and sand ahead, the mood shifted. The cries grew louder. Priests began the final prayers, summoning Anubis to guide the dead. At the tomb entrance, the coffin was lowered once more, and one last ritual took place, the final opening of the mouth. Priests touched the coffin, not just the mummy, with sacred tools, declaring again that the soul could speak, eat and breathe in the afterlife. It was a safeguard, a second insurance policy. Then came the burial. The coffin was slid into the tomb, the jars arranged around it, the treasures laid in order. Family members brought final offerings: a loaf of bread, a jar of beer, sometimes a lock of hair or a scrap of clothing. They whispered last words, promises, memories, pleas, and then one by one they turned away. The priest sealed the tomb with plaster and stone, inscribed curses to ward off thieves. "Cursed be he who disturbs this grave. May his body rot, may his name be forgotten." The door was closed. The desert swallowed it, but the funeral didn't end there. For weeks, even months after, families returned with offerings. They left food and drink at the tomb, calling the name of the dead aloud. Names mattered more than anything. To be remembered was to live. To be forgotten was the second death, the only death Egyptians truly feared. And so, even in grief, they celebrated. They told stories of the deceased, praised their virtues, exaggerated their kindness, ignored their flaws. The dead were reborn as Osiris, and Osiris could never be ordinary. To us, a funeral is the end. To the Egyptians, it was the start of eternity. The procession wasn't a farewell march. It was a passage, a noisy, dusty, perfumed bridge between two worlds. The body now lay underground, wrapped and silent. But the real question remained. What happened next? What did the Egyptians believe awaited their dead beyond the sealed door of the tomb? The funeral procession ended at the mouth of the tomb. Stone sealed the entrance, curses carved into plaster warned intruders away, and darkness swallowed the body whole. For the living, this was the end. But for the Egyptians, it was only the beginning. To step inside a tomb was to step into a map of eternity itself. The walls glowed with colour. Torchlight flickered over painted scenes. Fields of grain stretching to the horizon. Blue waters of the Nile. Boats with white sails billowing in an eternal breeze. Servants carried baskets of figs. Geese roasted on spits. Women poured wine. Families dined together. Young forever. Joyous forever. This was the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise. It looked like life in Egypt, only perfected. The Nile never failed. Crops never withered. Families never aged. In the field of reeds, every man farmed his own land without toil. Every woman wove in peace. Every child played in eternal sunlight. It was not a heaven of clouds and angels. It was Egypt, remade without suffering. But reaching this paradise was not simple. The journey through the afterlife was fraught with danger. Tomb walls whispered of it in painted spells. Rivers of fire, lakes of knives, serpents that spat poison, gates guarded by monstrous beings. The soul had to pass through all of it, armed only with magic words. That's why papyri of the Book of the Dead were buried with the corpse. Each spell was a password, each incantation a key. Without them, the soul would falter, lost in darkness. Imagine the terror, the dead standing before a lake of flames. Without the right words, they burn. With them, the flames part, becoming harmless water, or a giant serpent coils around the path, ready to swallow whole. Say the right name, the secret title of the serpent, and it bows, letting the soul pass. The afterlife was not guaranteed. It had to be earned, trick by trick, spell by spell. Inside the tomb, miniature figurines stood lined in rows, ushabtis, small servants made of clay or faience, sometimes hundreds of them. Their purpose? To work in the afterlife. Because even in paradise the Egyptians feared toil. The gods might demand labour, so the ushabtis would rise at the call and declare, "Here I am, I will work in his place." Eternity was not only about joy, it was about protection against every possible demand. Food offerings were piled around the coffin. Jars of beer, loaves of bread, onions, dried fish, even models of cattle, geese or boats. For the wealthy, real animals were sacrificed and buried with them. To us it seems grotesque, to slaughter a goose or an ox for a dead man. To them it was foresight. The dead needed sustenance. And then there were the letters. Archaeologists have found scraps of papyrus and ostraka, inscribed with words from the living to the dead, apologies, requests, confessions. "Forgive me, brother, for the quarrel we had. Help me with the harvest from where you are." The dead were not gone. They were family still, capable of vengeance or blessing. The tomb itself was a machine of eternity. Every symbol, every colour mattered. Blue and green represented rebirth, black represented fertility and the rich soil of the Nile, Gold was the colour of the gods themselves. Stars painted on ceilings became the night sky, promising the soul a place among them. Even the sarcophagus was decorated with protective deities, spells etched into stone. And then came the most frightening scene of all, painted on countless tomb walls, the weighing of the heart. We saw it earlier in belief. Here it was made visible. Osiris sat on his throne, green-skinned and regal. The scales stood tall. The feather of Mart gleamed on one side, the heart on the other. 42 judges watched, each demanding the soul confess its innocence of specific sins. I have not stolen, I have not lied, I have not polluted the river, I have not murdered. The confessions went on and on. The dead recited them like a litany, hoping the scales would balance. At the feet of the scales crouched Amit, jaws open. One tilt and she devoured. Tomb paintings made sure no one forgot. Judgment was final. There was no second chance, but if the scales balanced, Osiris extended his hand. The soul passed into the field of reeds, welcomed by family and ancestors. The tomb paintings showed this moment again and again. The dead man ploughing fields, drinking beer, embracing his wife. An eternity of life, perfect and unbroken. And so, when you step into an Egyptian tomb today, you don't just see art. You see belief turned into walls, floors, ceilings. You see a roadmap for eternity, directions carved and painted so clearly that even a frightened soul, stumbling through darkness, could follow them. The tomb was not a place of death, it was a place of rebirth. When the funeral procession ended and the tomb swallowed the dead, the body was not simply placed into one coffin and left to rest. That would have been far too vulnerable, too simple for the Egyptians' vision of eternity. Instead, the dead were encased like secrets within secrets, a layered fortress of wood, stone, paint, and prayer. The body became a mystery, nested in coffins within coffins. It began with the innermost case, a human-shaped coffin, often carved from wood, painted to resemble the deceased. Eyes lined with coal, lips red, skin painted yellow for women, reddish-brown for men. Hieroglyphs covered the surface, names, titles, spells from the Book of the Dead. To us, it looks like decoration. To the Egyptians, it was armour made of words. That inner coffin was sometimes placed into a second one, slightly larger, also anthropoid. This outer shell added another layer of protection. And then for the wealthy or royal came a third, fourth, even fifth coffin. Tutankhamun lay in 3 nested coffins, the innermost made of solid gold, the outer ones of gilded wood. For great pharaohs, coffins became shrines in themselves, gleaming with inlaid glass, lapis lazuli and turquoise. Finally, the whole set of coffins was lowered into a massive stone sarcophagus, carved with hieroglyphs and protective gods. The sarcophagus was so heavy, it took dozens of men to move, its lid weighing tons. Once sealed, it was as much a prison as a sanctuary, ensuring the body inside could never be reached by thieves. Or at least, so they hoped. Why so many layers? Partly, it was practical. Each coffin shielded the one within from humidity, insects, and the gnawing of time. But the deeper reason was symbolic. The body was being cocooned, reborn as Osiris himself. Just as the Nile carried layers of silt, just as the world had layers of sky, earth, and underworld, so too was the dead enveloped in cosmic shells. On the lids of coffins, gods stretched their wings across the painted body, shielding it. Nut, the sky goddess, was often shown arching above, her stars forming the heavens. Osiris appeared, arms crossed, welcoming the soul to his kingdom. Isis and Nephthys knelt at the head and feet, eternal mourners. To close the coffin was to seal the dead not in wood, but in divine protection. Families who could not afford multiple coffins improvised. Some painted false coffins on the walls of tombs, believing that images had power equal to objects. Others used simple wooden boxes, painted with a face and hands, as if mimicry could trick the gods. Even poverty could not erase the need for layers, but coffins were not only barriers against the outside world, they were also stages for the story of the dead. Hieroglyphic inscriptions recorded names and titles so they would not be forgotten. Scenes of offerings, spells and prayers reminded the gods of the soul's worth. In a sense, the coffin spoke for the silent body. If the mummy could not defend itself before the tribunal of Osiris, the words painted on its case would plead in its place. There was also fear, raw, practical fear. Tomb robbers haunted Egypt, even in ancient times. Families knew that gold, jewellery, and food buried with the dead tempted the living. Layer upon layer of coffins, stone lids, hidden chambers, all were attempts to slow the thieves down, to buy time, to make plundering too difficult. Of course, most failed. Even Tutankhamun's tomb, the most famous of all, bore signs of break-ins, but the layers reflected hope, that somehow the dead might remain untouched. And still the spiritual meaning outweighed the fear. Each coffin was a second skin, a magical shell, a declaration that this was not a corpse but a god. When priests slid the lid shut, they were not burying a man or woman. They were sealing an Osiris, a being destined for eternity. Imagine standing before the nested coffins, one after another, like a corridor narrowing into eternity. Each lid closes with a thud, echoing in the chamber. With every layer, the body vanishes further from the world of the living. By the time the final sarcophagus is sealed, the person is gone completely, not lost, but transformed. And yet, amid all this grandeur, one detail mattered above all: the name. Carved, painted, written again and again, across coffins and sarcophagi. The Egyptians believed that to erase a name was to kill a soul forever. That's why so many pharaohs' names were chiselled out by enemies. To strip the name was to strip eternity. Coffins were the insurance policy. Even if every statue crumbled, the name inside would remain. So the dead lay hidden, layered in wood, stone, paint, and word. Not simply buried, but wrapped in a labyrinth of eternity. A single body, encased in shells of meaning, waiting for the gods to call it awake. The coffins were sealed. The sarcophagus was slid into its stone chamber. The tomb entrance was plastered shut, blocked with rubble, hidden beneath sand. But even as priests muttered their last prayers, a question hung in the hot air: what if someone breaks in? Egyptians knew greed never died. They saw it in life. Neighbours stealing water from irrigation ditches, merchants cheating with false weights, officials bribed with bread and beer. Why should death be any different? The Valley of the Kings was not a quiet resting place. It was a battlefield between eternity and hunger. So they turned to the one weapon stronger than stone: words, curses. Some were carved directly into walls, others painted on limestone blocks, and still others scribbled on papyrus buried near the coffin. They weren't metaphorical, they were direct threats, promises of cosmic violence. One chilling inscription reads: "Whoever enters my tomb, whoever violates my coffin, may his head be severed, may his neck twisted like a goose, may he be denied both earth and sky." Another sneers: "May the crocodile seize him in the water, may the snake bite him on land, may the hippopotamus trample him in the marsh." These weren't empty words. Egyptian believed language itself carried magic. Heka. To carve a curse was to bind reality. Just as a spell could open the mouth of a mummy, so too could a curse summon crocodiles and serpents against a thief. But the protection didn't stop with words. Priests filled tombs with traps of a different kind. Passages were deliberately confusing, doors false, walls painted to look like exits. Some tombs contained hidden pits. Step in the wrong direction, and you'd fall into darkness. Others were packed with rubble, forcing intruders to dig endlessly through dead ends. Even more eerie were the magical guardians. Painted figures of jackals, serpents, and demons covered the walls, each holding knives. Inscriptions gave them names and powers. He who cuts the throat, the burner of hearts. The idea was simple. If you disturbed the dead, these guardians would come alive. Tomb robbers didn't just fear guards with clubs. They feared demons with wings and knives waiting in painted silence. And then, of course, there were the gods themselves. Osiris watched every grave. Anubis guarded every embalming. To rob a tomb wasn't only to steal gold. It was to blaspheme against gods who could strike down a thief in this life and damn him in the next. Despite all this, the truth is sobering. Most tombs were robbed. Curses didn't stop hunger. Traps didn't stop greed. Stone cracked, seals shattered, sarcophagi pried open. The treasures we see in museums today are the rare survivors, the exceptions, the miracles that slipped through the centuries untouched. And yet, the Egyptians would not have been surprised. They didn't expect perfection. Their obsession with layers, coffins, curses, spells, it wasn't naive, it was desperation. They knew eternity was fragile. They knew memory could be erased. They knew bodies could be destroyed. So they built walls of linen, walls of words, walls of paint, hoping something, anything, might last. And remarkably, it did. 3,000 years later, we still speak their names. We still open their tombs, read their curses, smell the faint bite of resin on mummified skin. We know their prayers, their spells, their fears, even when thieves tore jewellery from their corpses, even when kings erased their rivals' names, even when sand buried their cities, something endured. Perhaps that was the real magic of mummification. Not the salt or the resin, not the linen or the jars, but the belief itself. A belief so stubborn it refused to die, so loud it echoes still. So the tomb is sealed. The priests step back into the sun. The family leaves offerings one last time, their tears drying in desert wind. Inside, the mummy lies in darkness, swaddled in linen, armoured with amulets, guarded by words sharp as knives. Silence falls. Sand drifts over the entrance. The Nile floods and recedes. Centuries pass. Robbers come, kings fall, dynasties crumble. But the body waits. Perhaps it still waits.